Okay, so we are moving to the next presentation by Dr. Rowland Burdon. Dr. Burdon is an emeritus scientist with Scion, the Forest Research Institute in Rotorua, New Zealand.
It's well known that there is much within-tree variation in wood properties, and that poses problems for processing and utilization, but it also presents opportunities. Now, for studying and characterizing the variation, there is a need for a conceptual framework, and that can govern sampling protocols in terms of where one takes wood specimens and what wood properties one studies. It can also feed into basis for log segregation and even for capitalizing on within log differences, say by choice of sawing pattern. A key element of within tree variation in wood properties is pith to bark variation, which is often studied in relation to ring number from the pith or sometimes distance from the pith. This variation involves a suite of wood properties and not just wood density. The pattern of variation tends to be roughly asymptotic, reaching a final more or less steady state well out from the pith. But the various wood properties do not vary in lockstep with each other. Also, this pattern of pith to bark variation has implications for other patterns. For instance, with the differing numbers of rings represented at different heights of the tree, that can automatically lead on to different means for the various properties at different heights. This pith to bark variation has been addressed historically in the concept of juvenile versus mature wood. But a better term, a much more precisely descriptive one, is a progression from core wood to outer wood. But with the historical concept of it's often been defined by wood density, which is a convenience variable to study. And even in some cases, authors have adopted a fairly arbitrary density threshold for demarcating between so-called juvenile wood and mature wood. This can be satisfactory in respect of very young trees, which will contain juvenile wood, whatever the criterion used. Also, if wood properties that matter have height-independent trajectories, they do not vary up the tree in relation to ring number from the pith, that can be satisfactory. Or if one is sampling at a single height, say breast height only, that can also be satisfactory. But this historical approach is incorrect in a number of respects. First of all, some important wood properties have very different radial trajectories up the bowl. These include microfibril angle and modulus of elasticity in relation to density, and fiber coarseness, grain spirality, and even grain waviness. it's incorrect also, or unsatisfactory, in not accommodating the fact that one often has somewhat anomalous wood near ground level, right near the pith. It does not accommodate the fact that top logs and thinnings, even though they may be of similar diameters and with similar numbers of rings from the pith, can be appreciably different wood. And most important of all, the historical concept of juvenile versus mature wood is in very sharp conflict with a well-established botanical concept of maturation, and of course with the core-wood, outer-wood concept or terminology. No such problem arises. With maturation, it represents a progression from the ground up as the tree gets taller and larger. It behaves roughly asymptotically with a final maturation state of full maturity well up the tree. Various traits are involved in maturation. You have foliage, which changes from a distinctive juvenile form to the adult form. You have the progression towards producing sealed buds. The bark thickness, in fact, tends to change quite appreciably. Very importantly, you have a decline in propagability, the ability of cuttings to root. You have the onset of reproduction, and a number of wood properties are involved. For instance, microfibril angle in relation to a given ring number from the pith tends to decline up the tree, whereas correspondingly modulus of elasticity increases. Fiber coarseness increases, as does grain spirality. That waviness of grain tends to disappear up the tree. An important aspect of maturation is revealed by the fact that in species that will coppice, the stump sprouts tend to have the characteristics of the seedlings rather than the tops of the relatively old trees that have been felled. In this behavior, various traits, including wood properties, do have somewhat variable trajectories, so they don't all vary in lockstep. And importantly, maturation is essentially irreversible except during the process of seed production, in which the maturation state is effectively reset to zero. Now, I had proposed a synthesis, and it represents a new framework of progressions in wood properties in two different axes. In the radial axis, you have the progression from core wood to outer wood. And in the vertical or longitudinal axis, you have the progression from juvenility to the mature state. Here is a figure that has been drawn to represent a fairly typical situation with Pinus radiata. And you have the progressions illustrated in the two different axes. You have the fully juvenile core wood at the near ground level, and then you have the which is very pronounced in the first 2.5 meters, about up to 3 meters, and then you have a transitional zone towards 5 meters, and above 5 meters, the wood properties are essentially mature. But in the radial axis, you have the first 10 rings, which represent core wood, with a rapid progression in the first few rings. And then in the next 5 rings, you have a transitional zone with outer wood beyond that. Now, with the essentially smooth transitions, the boundaries that have been drawn in this diagram do reflect somewhat arbitrary thresholds. Now, coming back to the synthesis, it's important to note that there are many variations about the basic schema. You have a high degree of variation among species in the magnitude and importance of within tree variation in wood properties. And then you have in the background genetic differences within species. You have influences of site, and you have the heterogeneous, somewhat slightly heterogeneous behavior of the individual properties, even within species, noting that among species, the behavior of wood properties can be highly heterogeneous in these progressions. That said, with all these qualifications, the model still represents a very powerful conceptual framework for addressing the within tree variation, and particularly in some of the most important tree species. Finally, I need to make some acknowledgements to Paul Kibblewhite, with whom I had the discussions that led me to the central idea, to Dave Kahn and Bob McGraw and John Walker, on whose work I drew particularly heavily, and there are many others who have contributed in other ways, including Lloyd Donaldson, who's helped me make this recording. And finally, I would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to restate my message. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Burdon, for interesting presentation. Juvenile wood has always been an issue in processing and timber processing and utilization.